As the 18th century drew to a close, the world stood at the threshold of transformation. The year 1800 arrived quietly, with most of the planet still living much as their ancestors had for centuries. But change was already stirring, beginning in the valleys and cities of Britain, where something remarkable was taking shape. In the textile mills of Manchester and the iron foundries of Birmingham, a new age was being forged. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in Britain in the late 1700s, was now gathering unstoppable momentum. Steam-powered machinery was replacing human hands, and factories were rising where farmland once stretched. This wasn't just a change in how things were made. It was a change in how people lived, worked, and understood their place in the world. Picture, if you will, the world's population at the dawn of this century. Approximately 1 billion people called Earth home in 1800, a number that seems almost quaint by today's standards. Most of these people lived in rural areas, working the land as their families had done for generations. Cities existed, of course, but they were small by our modern understanding. London, the largest city in the Western world at the time, held about 1 million souls within its smoky embrace. The way people moved across distances was about to change dramatically. In 1804, a Welsh engineer named Richard Trevithick demonstrated something that would reshape civilization itself: the first steam locomotive. It wasn't elegant or particularly fast, but it proved that steam power could move not just machinery, but people and goods across the landscape. This moment planted the seed for the railway age that would soon connect continents and compress time itself. As the first decade unfolded, political earthquakes were reshaping the map. Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of France in 1804, standing in Notre Dame Cathedral and placing the crown upon his own head. His ambitions would send shockwaves across Europe for the next decade, redrawing borders and challenging old empires. The Napoleonic Wars would touch nearly every corner of the continent, forcing nations to modernize their armies, their industries, and their thinking. But while Europe wrestled with Napoleon's shadow, something equally momentous was happening across the Atlantic. In 1803, the United States completed the Louisiana Purchase, acquiring approximately 828,000 square miles of territory from France for $15 million. With one transaction, President Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of the young nation, opening vast expanses of land that would beckon settlers westward and forever alter the continent's destiny. The movement of people and ideas was accelerating. Communication, however, remained bound by the speed of horses and ships. A letter sent from New York to London might take 6 to 8 weeks to arrive, weather permitting. News of battles, births, and deaths traveled slowly, creating a world where distance still meant something profound, where far away truly felt far. Yet human ingenuity was already working to shrink these distances. The seeds of global connectivity were being planted, though few could imagine where they would lead. In laboratories and workshops, in universities and solitary studies, inventors and thinkers were puzzling over problems that would, piece by piece, transform human existence. The cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, was now revolutionizing agriculture in the American South. By 1800, it had dramatically increased cotton production, making the crop enormously profitable. This single invention would have profound consequences, both economic and moral, strengthening the institution of slavery in ways that would echo through the century and beyond. As you drift deeper into rest Imagine the world of 1800, a world lit by candles and hearth fires, where most people never travel more than 20 miles from where they were born, where the rhythm of life followed the sun in seasons, and where change, though coming, still moved at a human pace. The 19th century was just beginning its story, and what a story it would tell. Transportation continued its revolution. By 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway in England became the first public railway to use steam locomotives to carry passengers and freight. George Stephenson's locomotive, named Locomotion, pulled the first train, announcing its arrival with a whistle that must have seemed like a call from the future. The railway age had truly begun, and the world would never be the same. Let your mind wander through these decades of discovery and transformation. Imagine the first flicker of gaslight on a London street, the rumble of the first passenger train, the moment a doctor first heard a heartbeat through a wooden tube. These small moments, these quiet innovations, were weaving together to create a new world, one invention at a time. Rest now, as we journey further into the century of wonders. As the 1830s dawned, the pace of change accelerated still further. In 1831, Michael Faraday, working in his London laboratory, discovered electromagnetic induction, the principle that would make electric generators and transformers possible. By moving a magnet through a coil of wire, he could produce an electric current. This elegant dance between magnetism and electricity would, within decades, light entire cities and power industries beyond imagination. The same decade brought a quiet revolution in communication. In 1837, two separate systems of electrical telegraph were developed, one by Charles Wheatstone and William Cooke in England, and another by Samuel Morse in America. For the first time in human history, messages could travel faster than the swiftest horse, faster than any ship. Morse's system, with simple dots and dashes, will become the standard, shrinking the world in ways that felt almost magical to those who witnessed it. Across the ocean, the young United States was expanding with remarkable speed. The 1830s saw the forced removal of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the Southeast, a tragic chapter known as the Trail of Tears. Beginning in 1831 and culminating in 1838, thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole people were marched westward to designated Indian territory, with thousands dying along the way. It was a reminder that progress and civilization often came at terrible human cost. In Britain, social reform was stirring. The Reform Act of 1832 expanded voting rights, though still only propertied men, and began the long process of making government more representative. It was a small step, but it acknowledged the growing truth that ordinary people deserved a voice in their own governance. The seeds of modern democracy were taking root, even if the tree would take generations to fully grow. Science continued to illuminate the natural world. In 1838, Matthias Schleiden proposed that all plants are made of cells, and a year later, Theodor Schwann extended this idea to animals. Cell theory, the understanding that all living things are composed of these tiny, self-contained units, became one of the foundational principles of modern biology. Life itself was being understood in new ways, revealing an intricate architecture invisible to the naked eye. The 1840s brought an innovation that would change warfare, hunting, and the American frontier forever. In 1836, Samuel Colt patented the first practical revolving firearm, the revolver. By the 1840s, Colt's factory in Connecticut was mass-producing these weapons, which would fire multiple shots without reloading. It was a technology that would become synonymous with the American West and would alter the balance of power in conflicts around the world. Meanwhile, a humble postal reform in Britain was transforming how people stayed connected. In 1840, Sir Rowland Hill introduced the penny post, which allowed anyone to send a letter anywhere in Britain for just 1 penny, prepaid with small adhesive stamp, the world's first postage stamp, known as the penny black. This simple innovation made written communication affordable for ordinary people, and soon letters were flowing across the country in unprecedented numbers. Photography was maturing from experiment to art. In 1839, Louis Daguerre announced his daguerreotype process to the world, creating images on silver-plated copper that were remarkably detailed and permanent. For the first time, people could capture accurate likenesses of themselves and their loved ones. Portrait painting would never hold the same monopoly on memory. The camera was learning to see. Let yourself sink deeper into comfort as you contemplate these years. Picture the wonder of a telegraph operator tapping out a message that would arrive hundreds of miles away in moments. Imagine the excitement of sending your first letter with a tiny black stamp, or seeing your own face captured in silver for the first time. The world was becoming more connected, more documented, more understood. And still, the century had decades of discovery ahead. The mid-century years brought both revolution and revelation. In 1848, a wave of uprising swept across Europe. France, the German states, the Austrian Empire, Italy, and beyond. Workers, students, and reformers took to the streets demanding constitutions, voting rights, and an end to aristocratic privilege. Though most of these revolutions were ultimately suppressed, they planted ideas that would reshape European politics for generations. The old order was cracking, even if it hadn't yet broken. That same year, across the world in California, a carpenter named James Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill. The news spread like wildfire, and by 1849, hundreds of thousands of people were rushing westward, transforming California almost overnight. The gold rush brought people from every continent: Chinese laborers, Chilean miners, European fortune seekers, creating a chaotic, diverse society unlike anything America had seen before. San Francisco grew from a sleepy town of hundreds to a booming city of tens of thousands in just a few years. Medicine was making strides that would spare humanity untold suffering. In 1846, William Morton publicly demonstrated the use of ether as an anesthetic during surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital. For the first time, patients could undergo operations without the agonizing pain that had made surgery a last, desperate resort. Surgery was no longer an ordeal to be endured in conscious terror, but a procedure that could be performed with precision and care. The written word was reaching new audiences through an unlikely medium. In 1843, Charles Dickens published A Christmas Carol, a novella that would become one of the most beloved stories in the English language. But Dickens was part of a broader transformation: the rise of serialized fiction in newspapers and magazines, making literature accessible and affordable to the working classes. Stories were no longer just for the wealthy. They belonged to everyone who could read. As the 1850s unfolded, the world was being stitched together by undersea cables. In 1851, the first successful submarine telegraph cable was laid across the English Channel, connecting Britain and France. Messages that once required a sea voyage could now pass beneath the waves in minutes. It was the beginning of a network that would eventually span oceans, allowing continents to speak to one another almost instantaneously. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in London's magnificent Crystal Palace, showcased the technological marvels of the age to over 6 million visitors. This massive structure of glass and iron, itself a wonder of engineering, housed exhibits from around the world. Locomotives, telegraphs, printing presses, industrial machinery, and exotic goods from distant colonies. It was a celebration of progress, a statement that humanity had entered a new era of innovation and prosperity. Yet prosperity was far from universal. In Ireland, the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 brought unspeakable tragedy. A potato blight destroyed the crop that millions depended on for survival. An inadequate government response turned agricultural failure into catastrophe. Over 1 million people died of starvation and disease, and another 1 million emigrated, many to America. The Irish diaspora would reshape nations across the ocean, but it began in profound suffering. Science was peering deeper into the mysteries of life itself. In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, presenting his theory of evolution by natural selection. The idea that all life on Earth shared common ancestry, that species change over time through process of adaptation, revolutionized biology, and challenged long-held beliefs about creation. It remains one of the most influential scientific works ever published. Close your eyes and drift through this transformative decade. Feel the excitement of the gold fields, the relief of painless surgery, the wonder of the Crystal Palace gleaming in the London sun. Imagine Darwin in his study, piecing together the puzzle of life's diversity, or the first message traveling beneath the English Channel through a copper wire. Progress and tragedy walked hand in hand through these years, shaping the world that was to come. The 1860s arrived with a storm that would reshape a nation. In 1861, the American Civil War began, pitting the industrialized North against the agricultural South in a conflict that would claim over 600,000 lives. The war was fought over slavery, states' rights, and the very definition of what America would be. It was the first truly modern war, with railroads moving troops, telegraphs coordinating armies, and new weapons like the rifled musket making battlefields deadlier than ever before. Yet even amid the chaos of war, innovation continued. In 1863, the first section of the London Underground opened, creating the world's first underground railway system. Steam locomotives pulled passengers through tunnels beneath the city streets, offering a glimpse of urban transportation's future. Cities were growing so large that movement above ground was no longer enough. They had to burrow beneath themselves to keep flowing. Communication was about to take another giant leap. In 1866, after several failed attempts, a telegraph cable was successfully laid across the Atlantic Ocean, connecting Europe and North America. Queen Victoria and President Andrew Johnson exchanged messages, and the world marveled at how the vast ocean had been conquered by a copper wire. News that once took weeks to cross the Atlantic now arrived in minutes. Science was unlocking the fundamental building blocks of matter. In 1869, Dmitri Mendeleev published his periodic table of elements, organizing all known chemical elements by their properties and atomic weight. His arrangement revealed patterns in nature and even predicted the existence of elements not yet discovered. It was a map of matter itself, showing that beneath the bewildering diversity of substances, There was order and logic. The same year, 1869, saw another kind of connection forged. The first transcontinental railroad was completed in the United States when the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads met at Promontory Summit, Utah. A golden spike was driven into the final tie, and suddenly the journey from coast to coast, which once took months by wagon, could be made in less than a week. America had stitched itself together with iron rails. Medicine continued its march toward understanding. In 1865, Louis Pasteur demonstrated that microorganisms cause fermentation and spoilage, laying the groundwork for germ theory. His work would eventually save countless lives by showing that invisible organisms could cause disease. The idea that tiny creatures too small to see could sicken and kill was revolutionary, and it would transform medicine, surgery, and public health. In 1867, Alfred Nobel patented dynamite, creating a powerful explosive that was more stable and safer to handle than nitroglycerin. Nobel intended it for construction and mining, and indeed it helped build tunnels, blast through mountains, and reshape landscapes. But like so many innovations, it proved to be a double-edged sword, finding use in warfare as well as industry. The struggle for human rights was advancing, though slowly and painfully. In 1865, the United States ratified the 13th Amendment, officially abolishing slavery throughout the nation. 4 million people who had been held in bondage were declared free, though the journey toward true equality would be long and is ongoing still. It was a moment of profound moral reckoning for a nation that had claimed to value liberty from its founding. Let your breathing slow as you contemplate these years of conflict and connection. Imagine the telegraph operator receiving the first message from across the Atlantic, the railway workers driving that golden spike in Utah, Pasteur peering through his microscope at the invisible world of microbes. The century was past its midpoint now, and the modern world was taking recognizable shape. Railways spanned continents, cables crossed oceans, and science was revealing nature's deepest secrets, one discovery at a time. As the 1870s began, the world witnessed the unification of nations. In 1871, the German states, which had existed as separate kingdoms and principalities for centuries, were unified into German Empire following Prussia's victory in the Franco-Prussian War. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, had orchestrated this transformation through careful diplomacy and strategic warfare. A new European power had emerged, one that would reshape the continent's balance for generations. That same year, across the world in Tokyo, Japan was undergoing its own dramatic transformation. The Meiji Restoration, which had begun in 1868, was rapidly modernizing Japan as the nation opened itself to Western technology and ideas after centuries of isolation. Railways, telegraph lines, and factories were being built at remarkable speed. Japan was determined to join the ranks of modern industrial powers, and it was succeeding with breathtaking rapidity. Communication was becoming not just faster, but richer. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell spoke the famous words, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," into his experimental device, and Thomas Watson heard them in another room. The telephone had been born. Unlike the telegraph with its dots and dashes, the telephone carried the human voice itself across wires, making distance feel suddenly less absolute. Within decades, telephone networks would connect cities, then nations. The same year brought another innovation that would capture human imagination. Thomas Edison established his laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, which would become a factory of invention. Edison's approach was systematic and prolific. He would eventually hold over 1,000 patents. In 1877, he invented the phonograph, a device that could record sound and play it back. For the first time in history, a voice or a melody could be preserved and heard again and again. Light itself was being harnessed in new ways. In 1879, Edison developed a practical, long-lasting incandescent light bulb. While others had created electric lights before, Edison's design, with its carbonized bamboo filament, could burn for hundreds of hours. Electric light was cleaner, safer, and more controllable than gas or candles. The world was about to glow with a new kind of illumination. Infrastructure was becoming grander and more ambitious. The Brooklyn Bridge, begun in 1870, was taking shape across New York's East River. When it opened in 1883, it would be the longest suspension bridge in the world, its Gothic towers rising majestically above the water. It was both a practical connection between Manhattan and Brooklyn, and a work of art, a testament to what engineering and human ambition could achieve. Medicine was becoming more scientific and systematic. In 1876, Robert Koch identified the bacterium that caused anthrax, providing concrete proof that specific microorganisms cause specific diseases. This was a confirmation that germ theory needed visible evidence under the microscope. Koch would go on to identify the bacteria responsible for tuberculosis and cholera, giving medicine clear targets to fight against. The American West was still being settled, often violently. In 1876, at the Battle of Little Bighorn, a coalition of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors defeated Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry. It was a stunning victory for the Native American forces, but it would be one of their last. The U.S. government's campaign to confine Native peoples to reservations would intensify in the years that followed. Rest peacefully as you drift through these years of invention and transformation. Imagine the wonder of hearing a voice through a telephone for the first time, the warm glow of Edison's electric bulb pushing back the darkness, the majestic span of the Brooklyn Bridge reaching across the water. The world was being illuminated, connected, and understood in ways that would have seemed like magic just decades before. The century was drawing toward its close, but its innovations were just beginning to reshape daily life. The 1880s brought motion to the stillness of photography. In 1888, George Eastman introduced the Kodak camera with the revolutionary slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest." For the first time, photography was accessible to ordinary people who knew nothing about chemistry or optics. You simply took your pictures, sent the entire camera back to Kodak, and received your photographs along with a reloaded camera. Memory was being democratized, one snapshot at a time. That same year, across the ocean, a bold engineering project was nearing completion. The Eiffel Tower, designed by Gustave Eiffel for the 1889 Paris Exposition, rose 1,063 feet above the city, the tallest structure in the world. Many Parisians initially despised it, calling it an eyesore, but this lattice of iron would become one of the world's most recognizable landmarks. It proved that iron could be both functional and beautiful, that industrial materials could create art. Transportation was evolving beyond rails. In 1885, Carl Benz built what is considered the first practical automobile powered by an internal combustion engine, the Benz Patent Motor Wagon. It was a three-wheel vehicle that could reach the dizzying speed of 10 miles per hour, Few could have imagined that within a few decades, millions of these machines would crowd the streets of every major city. Electricity was transforming urban life in dramatic ways. In 1882, Thomas Edison's Pearl Street Station in New York City began supplying electrical power to customers in Lower Manhattan, creating the world's first commercial electrical power grid. 59 customers could now light their homes and businesses with the flick of a switch. The age of electricity had moved from laboratory curiosity to public utility. Medicine achieved another breakthrough that would save millions of lives. In 1885, Louis Pasteur successfully tested his rabies vaccine on a 9-year-old boy named Joseph Meister, who had been bitten by a rabid dog. The boy survived, and vaccination, the idea of preventing disease before it occurred, gained powerful validation. Humanity was learning not just to treat illness, but to prevent it entirely. The world's labor movements were gaining strength and organization. In 1886, workers in Chicago and across America rallied for an 8-hour workday, culminating in the Haymarket Affair. Though the immediate aftermath was tragic, a bomb explosion and subsequent violence, the movement for workers' rights continued to grow. The idea that laborers deserved reasonable hours, fair wages, and safe conditions was taking root in the industrial world's conscience. Africa was being carved up by European powers in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 saw European nations divide the African continent among themselves with little regard for existing kingdoms, ethnic groups, or natural boundaries. By the 1880s, European colonialism was reaching its zenith, with profound and lasting consequences for the colonized peoples. The modern skyscraper was born during this decade. In 1885, the home insurance building in Chicago, designed by William LeBaron Jenney, became the first building to use a steel-framed structure, rising 10 stories high. Steel skeleton construction allowed buildings to reach heights that masonry construction could never achieve. Cities were learning to grow upward as well as outward. Let your mind drift through these final years of the century. Picture the first Kodak camera capturing a family moment, the Eiffel Tower rising above Paris in iron elegance, the first electric lights glowing in Manhattan windows. Imagine the chugging of an early automobile, the relief of a vaccine preventing a once certain death. The 19th century had transformed the world beyond recognition, and yet even greater changes lay ahead in the century to come. As the 1890s arrived, the world was learning to capture motion itself. In 1891, Thomas Edison introduced the kinetoscope, a device for viewing moving pictures. One person at a time could peer into the machine and watch brief films of dancers, acrobats, or everyday scenes come to life. It was primitive by later standards, but it was the seed from which cinema would grow. The moving image had been born. The same inventive spirit was transforming entertainment in other ways. In 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago, celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. Over 27 million people visited the White City, marveling at exhibits from around the world. The first Ferris wheel, and electric lighting that made the fairgrounds glow like a dream at night. It was a showcase of progress, though it largely ignored the perspectives and contributions of indigenous peoples and African Americans. Wireless communication was taking its first tentative steps. In 1895, Guglielmo Marconi successfully sent and received radio signals over a distance of about 1.2 miles in Italy. Unlike the telegraph, which required wires, Marconi's system used electromagnetic waves traveling to the air itself. The implications were staggering. Ships at sea could communicate, remote areas could be reached, and eventually voices and music could be broadcast to millions. Science was peering into realms previously invisible. In 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays quite by accident while experimenting with cathode ray tubes. He found that these mysterious rays could pass through soft tissue but not bone, creating ghostly images of the skeleton within. The first X-ray photograph was of his wife's hand, her wedding ring clearly visible on her bones. Medicine had gained the ability to see inside the living body without cutting it open. The struggle for women's rights was advancing, though progress remained frustratingly slow. In 1893, New Zealand became the first self-governing nation to grant women the right to vote in national elections. It was a landmark moment, proving that female suffrage was possible and setting an example that other nations would eventually follow. The idea that half of humanity deserved a political voice was gaining ground, though many countries would take decades more to embrace it. Transportation was becoming faster and more efficient. In 1896, Henry Ford completed his first automobile, the quadricycle, in a workshop in Detroit. Unlike Benz's earlier vehicles, Ford was already thinking about how to make cars affordable for ordinary people. His innovations in mass production would, in the next century, put America on wheels and transform society in ways few could predict. The modern Olympics were reborn during this decade. In 1896, the first modern Olympic Games were held in Athens, Greece, reviving a tradition that had ended in ancient times. Athletes from 14 nations competed in 43 events, rekindling the spirit of international athletic competition. It was a symbol of growing global interconnection, even as political tensions simmered beneath the surface. Science was discovering the fundamental nature of matter and energy. In 1897, J.J. Thomson discovered the electron, proving that atoms, long thought to be indivisible, were actually made of smaller particles. This tiny subatomic particle would prove to be the key to understanding chemistry, electricity, and eventually would enable the electronic age that defines our modern world. Settle deeper into rest as the century draws to a close. Imagine peering into a kinetoscope to see motion captured for the first time, the wonder of seeing your own bones on an X-ray image, the excitement of the first modern Olympics. The 1800s had witnessed humanity harness steam, electricity, and electromagnetism, had seen nations born and transformed, had connected the world with rails and wires. As the 19th century prepared to give way to the 20th, the pace of change was accelerating beyond anything previous generations had known. The final years of the 1890s brought discoveries that would reshape physics itself. In 1898, Marie and Pierre Curie discovered the elements polonium and radium while studying radioactive materials. Marie Curie's work was groundbreaking not just scientifically, but socially. She was one of the first women to achieve prominence in the male-dominated world of science. Her discoveries would open entirely new fields of research and, eventually, revolutionize medicine and energy production. Aspirin, one of the most widely used medicines in history, entered the world during these closing years. In 1897, Felix Hoffmann, working for the German company Bayer, synthesized a cell salicylic acid in a stable form. By 1899, Bayer was marketing it as aspirin, a pain reliever that was more effective and had fewer side effects than previous remedies. This small white tablet would become a household staple around the globe. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked America's emergence as a global power. The brief conflict resulted in the United States acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, while Cuba gained independence from Spain. America was no longer looking inward. It was projecting power across oceans, joining the ranks of imperial nations for better and worse. Technology was making the world smaller in yet another way. In 1899, the first international radio transmission was sent across the English Channel by Marconi, proving that wireless communication could cross national boundaries. Ships at sea were no longer isolated from the world. Soon, news, distress signals, and messages could reach anyone, anywhere, as long as they had the right equipment. Education was spreading to more people than ever before. By the 1890s, many industrialized nations had implemented compulsory elementary education. Literacy rates were rising dramatically, creating populations that could read newspapers, follow political debates, and access knowledge previously limited to the wealthy and educated classes. An informed citizenry was becoming a reality, though access remained unequal across class, race, and gender lines. The bicycle had evolved into something close to its modern form by the 1890s, and it was transforming society in unexpected ways. The safety bicycle, with its two equal-sized wheels and chain drive, gave people, especially women, unprecedented personal mobility. Cycling clubs formed, and the bicycle became associated with freedom and modernity. It was quietly revolutionary, allowing individuals to travel independently without the expense of a horse or the constraints of train schedules. Cities were growing at unprecedented rates, powered by industrialization and immigration. By 1900, London's population had reached 6.5 million, making it the largest city in the world. New York, Chicago, Paris, and Berlin were also swelling with people seeking opportunity in factories and offices. Urban life was becoming the norm for growing numbers of people, bringing both vitality and challenges, overcrowding, pollution, and social tensions. Public health was beginning to benefit from germ theory's insights. By the late 1890s, cities were investing in clean water systems, sewage treatment, and public sanitation programs. The understanding that disease could be prevented through hygiene and infrastructure was saving lives. Even the full medical toolkit to fight infectious diseases was still decades away. Clean water and proper sewage disposal were proving to be as important as any medicine. As the century's final year approached, humanity stood at a threshold. In 1900, the world's population had reached approximately 1.6 billion people, 60% more than at the century's start. Life expectancy was slowly climbing as medicine and sanitation improved. The world was more connected, more urban, more literate, and more technologically advanced than it had ever been. Let yourself relax completely as you consider this remarkable transformation. A century that began with candlelight and horse-drawn carriages had ended with electric lights, telephones, automobiles, and moving pictures. The 19th century had laid the foundation for the modern world. The century's final year saw the publication of Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams in 1899, though it was dated in 1900. Freud proposed that dreams were windows into the unconscious mind, that human behavior was driven by forces we weren't fully aware of. Whether one accepts his theories or not, psychoanalysis opened new ways of thinking about the human mind, consciousness, and the hidden depths of human motivation. Max Planck's work in 1900 on black body radiation led him to propose that energy was quantized, that it came in discrete packets he called quanta. This seemingly abstract idea will become the foundation of quantum mechanics, revolutionizing physics in the 20th century. The universe, it turned out, didn't operate quite the way common sense suggested at the smallest scales. Labor conditions in factories, mines, and workshops have been often brutal throughout much of the century. But by the 1890s, labor unions were gaining strength in many industrialized nations, fighting for better wages, safer conditions, and reasonable working hours. The 8-hour workday, a radical idea earlier in the century, was becoming reality in some places. Workers were finding their collective voice. The art world was transforming as dramatically as technology. Impressionism had emerged in the 1870s and 1880s, with artists like Monet, Renoir, and Degas breaking from traditional techniques to capture light and movement. By the 1890s, post-impressionism was pushing boundaries further. Artists were no longer simply trying to represent reality. They were interpreting it, expressing emotion and vision in ways that challenged centuries of convention. Life for women was beginning to change, though progress remained painfully slow. By the end of the century, women in some countries could attend universities, though they were still barred from many professions. The new woman of the 1890s, educated, independent, and increasingly vocal about her rights, was challenging Victorian ideals of femininity. The seeds of the 20th century's women's movements were being planted. Public libraries were spreading knowledge to the masses. Philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie funded the construction of thousands of public libraries in America and beyond, believing that free access to books could uplift communities and individuals. By century's end, the idea that everyone deserved access to knowledge was taking institutional form in libraries, public schools, and universities. The invention of the safety match earlier in the century had, by the 1890s, made fire readily available to anyone with a penny. This seemingly small innovation had enormous impact. Cooking, heating, and lighting were now simple matters. The ability to create fire instantly and safely was something humans had never possessed before, and it changed daily life in countless small ways. Refrigeration technology was advancing by the century's end. Mechanical refrigeration, developed throughout the 1800s, was beginning to preserve food on a commercial scale. Ice was no longer just a winter luxury or something harvested from frozen lakes. Food could be kept fresh longer, transported further, and wasted less. The seasonal limitations on human diet were beginning to ease. As we approach the end of our journey through the 1800s, consider one final transformation. The concept of childhood itself had changed. Earlier in the century, children in many families were economic assets who worked from young ages. By century's end, reformers had championed child labor laws, compulsory education, and the idea that childhood should be a protected time of learning and growth. The modern notion of childhood was taking shape, though its benefits remain unevenly distributed across society. And so the 19th century drew to a close. It had been a century of astonishing transformation, from rural to urban, from handcraft to machine production, from isolated communities to global networks of communication and trade. The world of 1900 would have been almost unrecognizable to someone from 1800. Steam and steel, electricity and engines, vaccines and votes. Humanity had reshaped its world and itself. The Suez Canal, completed in 1869, had connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, cutting thousands of miles off the journey between Europe and Asia. Ships no longer needed to sail around Africa. Global trade had been revolutionized by a channel cut through desert sands. The world's oceans were now more connected than ever before. Architecture had been transformed by new materials and ambitions. By the 1890s, skyscrapers were beginning to define American cityscapes, with buildings like the 1894 Manhattan Life Insurance Building reaching 17 stories. Steel frames and elevators, invented by Elisha Otis in the 1850s, made vertical cities possible. Humanity was learning to build upward toward the sky. The typewriter, commercialized in the 1870s by companies like Remington, had transformed office work by the century's end. Writing was no longer the exclusive domain of those with beautiful penmanship. The typewriter also created new employment opportunities for women, who became the first professional typists, opening doors to the business world that had been largely closed to them. Canned food, developed earlier in the century, had by the 1890s become widely available and affordable. Napoleon's armies had inspired the invention of food preservation in sealed containers, and now ordinary families could store food safely for months or years. Nutrition was no longer entirely dependent on the season or immediate locality. The germ theory of disease, championed by Pasteur and Koch, had by centuries end transformed medical practice. Antiseptic surgery, pioneered by Joseph Lister in the 1860s, using carbolic acid, dramatically reduced surgical infections and deaths. Operations that had once been death sentences now offered hope. Doctors were washing their hands and sterilizing instruments, saving countless lives through simple hygiene. Petroleum, discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859, had created an entirely new industry by century's end. Kerosene lamps lit millions of homes before electricity arrived. By the 1890s, petroleum was being refined into various products, and the internal combustion engine was beginning to create demand for gasoline. The oil age was dawning, though few yet understood how it would reshape geopolitics and the environment. The sewing machine, perfected by Isaac Singer in the 1850s, had revolutionized clothing production by the century's end. What once took hours of hand-stitching now took minutes. Ready-made clothing became affordable for working families, transforming fashion from a luxury into something accessible. People no longer needed to make all their own clothes or hire expensive seamstresses. Anesthesia had expanded beyond ether. By the 1880s, cocaine was being used as a local anesthetic in dentistry and surgery, before its dangers were fully understood. Chloroform offered another option, though it too had risks. Pain relief during medical procedures, unimaginable at the century's start, had become expected by its end, fundamentally changing the human experience of medicine. The discovery of vitamins was just beginning as the century closed. While the term wouldn't be coined until 1912, researchers in the 1890s were realizing that certain diseases like scurvy and beriberi were caused by dietary deficiencies, not germs. The understanding that food contained essential nutrients beyond just calories would revolutionize nutrition science in the coming century. As the clock struck midnight on December 31st, 1899, welcoming the year 1900, the world celebrated a century of unprecedented change. Cities glowed with electric light. Telegraph wires spanned continents. Steamships and trains connected distant places. Vaccines prevented diseases. Cameras captured memories. The telephone carried voices across miles. And humanity stood ready to carry these achievements forward into a new century that would bring even more dramatic transformations. Let these 100 moments of discovery, innovation, struggle, and change wash over you as you drift into peaceful sleep. The 19th century transformed human civilization, built by countless individuals, inventors tinkering in workshops, scientists peering through microscopes, workers organizing for dignity, artists imagining new ways of seeing, and ordinary people adapting to a world that changed faster than any before it. Rest now, knowing that each innovation, each discovery, each hard-won right was part of humanity's long journey. The 1800s carried us from one world into another, and the ripples of that transformation still shape our lives today. Sleep peacefully and dream of all that was built, discovered, and imagined in that remarkable century. May you rest well, knowing that progress, though imperfect, continues its patient work through time.